I feel like I'm a reasonably intelligent individual, but I don't understand why there is such a big argument uh, about people who are not citizens voting. Okay, let me rephrase that. I know why there's an argument, but I want to know what the logical train of thought for the average person who doesn't support voter ID laws is. So the bottom line is, if you're a citizen, you should vote. If you're not a citizen, you shouldn't vote. I think everybody agrees on that, right? Outside of a few weirdos. Everybody believes that. So then what's the problem with requiring an ID to vote? I've heard that, some people aren't smart enough to get IDs. That's bullshit, frankly. It's bullshit. I know pretty much every single person I've ever met in my life who doesn't have special needs knows how to go and get an ID. And matter of fact, they have an ID. I don't know that I've ever met a functioning adult who doesn't have an ID. The only people that I've met that don't walk around with at least an ID card, not necessarily a driver's license, but at least an ID card, are people that are out of their mind off some kind of drugs. Like, even when I was homeless, I was homeless for a good chunk of time about 7 years ago. The other homeless people and myself all had ID cards or driver's licenses. Everybody had one, except the people that were clucked out of their heads on crack. Those are the only people that I've ever met that don't have a driver's license or an ID. But the reason this is coming to the forefront, obviously, they just voted on the SAVE Act. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that the SAVE Act mattered, because obviously the Senate, it had been sitting in front of the Senate since, June, July? They could have just voted on it. They didn't. They sent it back. It's okay, well, we're going to attach it to the CR. And then they voted on that, and it didn't pass the House. Democrats and Republicans voted against it. But Biden had already said he was going to veto it if it went through. And you already knew it wasn't going to make it through the Senate. The Senate had the opportunity to vote on it, and they didn't even vote on it for months. So it was never going to pass. I can't figure out why. From the perspective of the people that are in power, I understand what they're doing. Because in a lot of states, there are people that are illegal immigrants. And even the White House acknowledges there's 10 million of them in the country. The number seems like it could be as high as 22 million. That number's been touted around. But we'll say 10 million for the sake of argument. And we know that illegal immigrants do vote in elections around the country in states where there are no voter ID laws. That's not a controversial claim. That is a generally accepted fact. And that should be seen as a bad thing. People that aren't paying taxes or contributing to, the Social Security system and so on are voting in elections that elect people that determine how that money is spent and how those policies are constructed. So I don't know how you can argue that proving that you're a citizen of the United States is a bad thing when you're voting. I genuinely don't know. So somebody explain to me, like I'm an idiot. I probably should be careful how I say that on the internet. But somebody explain to me, like I'm an idiot, why voter ID laws are a bad thing. Because the way I understand it, doesn't even have to be a government issue ID or driver's license. It could be a Social Security card. It could be a birth certificate. And everybody who's a citizen, for the most part, has one of those. What demographic of people don't have a Social Security number that can be checked? Even people that, I've heard it said, like, black people are too stupid to go and get, well, they don't phrase it like that, but that's what it amounts to. They say black people don't know how to go and get an ID, or they don't have access to it, which amounts to black people are stupid in my estimation, which I don't believe. Every black person I've ever known has had an ID. They've been, at least of average intelligence, if not greater. I have no idea why, the color of their skin has anything to do with them being able to get an ID. That's kind of stupid to me. but every single one of them has had a social security number that they knew off the top of their head. So if you take the name and the social security number and you run it through the system and say, okay, this is the right person, well, they get to vote once. They don't, like, I don't know why, everybody's got a social security card. Everybody's got a birth certificate or an ID. If you don't have any of those documents, I'd venture to say that your stuff is not together enough that you're even going to bother to go and vote. And that's the practicality of the thing. Not that that's necessarily right, but that probably is the case. What I'm getting at is that if you put a voter ID law in place, you would not hear an outcry from voters that my vote was, my ability to vote was impeded. You wouldn't hear it. What you would hear is politicians saying, well, we heard from such and such, anonymous source that they had trouble voting. And the person who actually had trouble voting, maybe they'll pay a few to come and say something, and maybe there'll be a handful. Maybe there'll be 5,000 people across the entire country that had such a unique circumstance where they weren't able to vote because of voter ID laws. I just do not see that happening. I've interacted with a lot of people in my life, a lot of people across a lot of states. I've lived in 7 states. I've lived in a lot of cities. I've met and known a lot of people. Not a single one of them. And that's of every socioeconomic class. Like I said, I've been homeless. I've lived in project housing, essentially. I've lived in an apartment where homeless people slept in all the hallways, and everybody who lived there was on welfare. I have lived around and among the people that they say are the disadvantaged groups that aren't able to go and procure an ID, and every single one of those people had an ID. I don't even know why the SAVE Act is necessary. I don't know why every single state hasn't enacted a voter ID law, knowing that there are people who are not legal immigrants voting in our elections. Why is that? It doesn't make sense. And there's so many people, like, I can understand it, like I said, from the politician's standpoint. They know that part of the reason they're being elected is because they've opened the border, they've called for the people to come in, and they've enacted policies that have allowed people who are not citizens to come in and vote. And those people are going to continue to vote for them because they want to stay here, right? That much is easy to understand. What I don't understand is why the legal constituents, the citizen constituents of these particular politicians are standing for it. It's crazy, especially because when you think about, let's say California, for example, your average California voter, let's say a Democrat, and I'm not saying anything, good or bad. I'm just saying they're a Democrat. Their values tend to be, pro-choice, pro-welfare, things like that. And then you have an influx of migrants from South America, which is predominantly Catholic. And I'm just saying any of them that we're not talking about gang affiliated or prison affiliated or anything like that. I'm talking about people that are genuinely just coming here for a better opportunity, and they come across the border illegally because it's easier that way. They're generally Catholic. They're generally conservative. There's not, what I'm saying is there's not like a huge motivating factor for Democrats and people with liberal values to want these conservative voices among their community, which could, if everything was done above board, it would probably sway the voting and demographics of their area. It doesn't, because those people come in illegally and they continue to vote Democrat because that's the only way they're going to be allowed to stay in the country. And maybe that's what it comes down to. The people in these Democratic strongholds, they want more voices that will only go Democrat. But in practicality within their community, you're going to have more people that are opposed to abortion. You're going to have more people that are, opposed to a welfare state. They're people whose values are, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like the traditional conservative, which, by the way, I am not. I don't understand the thought process of just your average Democratic voter who is voting for politicians whose policies allow this. And maybe someone can explain it to me, but I've had several conversations with quite a few people who support amnesty for everyone. And it, like, practically, functionally, economically, and culturally, it does not make any sense. That's all.